Welcome to EPG Padashala. I am Dr. P.P. Ajay Kumar, Professor of English, School of Distance Education, University of Kerala. Today we will discuss the poetry of Seamus Heaney, who is a 20th century English poet, and this come under the paper 20th century English literature. Seamus Heaney was an Irish poet, a playwright and a translator. He was the recipient of 1995 Nobel Prize for Literature. Seamus Heaney was the author of over 20 volumes of poetry and criticism. He also edited several anthologies. He was described as a lyrical poet with an ethical depth. Seamus Heaney also served as a professor at Harvard from 1981 to 1997. He was also the poet in residence from 1998 to 2006. He was also the professor of poetry at Oxford from 1989 to 1994. He got several awards like Geoffrey Faber Memorial Prize, the E.M. Forster Award, Penn Translation Prize, Golden Wreath of Poetry, T.S. Eliot Prize, Whitebread Prizes, etc. It is a fact that Ireland was a fertile land for poetry. Seamus Heaney also comes from Ireland, and it was Robert Lowell who described him as the most important Irish poet since Yeats. Many others described him in similar fashion. He was considered to be the greatest poet of our age. He died in 2013, and after his death, he was described as probably the best known poet of the world. It was true that even during his lifetime, Seamus Heaney was accepted and read the world over. One of the major attractions of Seamus Heaney's poetry is the subject matter. He often writes about modern Northern Ireland, its farms and cities beset with civil strife, its natural culture and language, which was overrun by the English rule. It is true that Seamus Heaney presented Ireland and its life with all its variety and beauty. The past and present of Ireland emerges in his poetry. Heaney's poetry is known for its oral beauty and the finely wrought textures. He was often described as a regional poet. It is because of his close association with that particular region. Unlike many other poets who were contemporaries of Seamus Heaney, he was a traditionalist who had a special love for the pre-modern world. A similar love for the past or the pre-modern rural life is seen in poets like William Wordsworth. Heaney also shared a similar kind of attitude. He describes the rural landscape, its people, the laborers, their tasks, their experiences, the natural phenomena, and its various manifestations. His lines are so clear and suggestive that it is said that Heaney makes you see, hear, smell, and taste the rural life. It is true that his poetry has various dimensions. It captures the sound, the smell, the music, and the very essence of the rural life in Ireland. It is true that Seamus Heaney as a poet was more concerned about his region, its landscape and its beauty, but he was also interested in the political troubles of that time. It was often violent struggles, and Seamus Heaney, being an Irish poet, cannot be blind to these violent struggles that were going on around him. He responded to these political events through his poetry, and at the same time, it is also a fact that he tried to look at these issues in a broader historical framework. His books, Wintering Out and North, are examples for his interest in the political struggles of that time. Seamus Heaney has written poems directly about the troubles that happened during his lifetime. He also wrote some elegies for friends and acquaintances who have died as part of the struggle. Heaney tried to discover a historical framework in which to interpret the current unrest prevalent in that society. He also believed that he had the right to speak for the people who are struggling for the nation, and he was a self-appointed spokesman for them. He believed that the people looked at him for comments and guidance. At the same time, Seamus Heaney was not an active politician. He did not even have the kind of involvement that W.H. Auden or Stephen Spender had in politics. He believed that poets have the right to be apolitical, and poets may not be able to influence the course of history or the political transformations that may happen in the society. One of the famous collections of poems written by Seamus Heaney, Selected Poems, published in 1990, is a collection of poems written between 1966 and 1987. Selected Poems present Heaney as a poet who was possessed by demons. The younger Heaney and the older Heaney are very different from one another. He was a poet who developed through ages. Seeing Things, published in 1991, was another important collection of poems by Heaney. This collection is supposed to be a collection of poems which are more spiritual and less concrete in approach. The language was extremely pure. Heaney uses words to create a new distanced perspective and a new mood in his poems. Another important collection, The Spirit Level, published in 1996, explores humanism, politics, and nature. Electric Light is a collection of poems published in 2001. In this collection, Heaney broadened his range of allusions. He refers to Homer, Virgil, and we find that he uses memory, elegy, and the pastoral tradition in his poems. John Taylor commented about Heaney that he notably attempts as an aging man to re-experience childhood and early adulthood perceptions in all their sensate fullness. It is true that Heaney was looking back to his past childhood days and experiences associated with it in his poetry. He was supposed to be Janus-faced, always looking back. Another collection, District and Circle, published in 2006, won him T.S. Eliot Prize. T.S. Eliot Prize is the most prestigious poetry award in UK. Commenting on the volume for the New York Times, critic Brad Leithuser found it remarkably consistent with the rest of Heaney's oeuvre. So the volume District and Circle was well appreciated by critics, and we find that it carries the authenticity and believability of the plain spoken, even though his words are anything but plain spoken. Heaney's stanzas are considered to be dense and full of subtle nuances and sounds. We find that Heaney is a poet who has an eye for the physiognomy of an object. He presents images which are real, connected with nature, and the images speaks for itself. We don't have to search the meaning of the words. It is the images that speaks. So his poetry is considered to be very different from the contemporary poets and those who came before him, that is the modernists as well as the movement poets. Apart from poetry, he was also a famous prose writer. His prose work, Finders, Keepers, Selected Prose, 1971 to 2001, published in 2002, earned the Truman Capote Award for Literary Criticism. In this work, Heaney was trying to present his own idea of poetry. He asked several questions. What is the good of poetry? How can it contribute to society? Is it worth the dedication it demands? We find that in this era of technological development and the development of science, poetry is often relegated to the margins. There are people who express their reservation about studying poetry. Heaney is trying to answer questions related to these doubts. Heaney is trying to answer such doubts about the relevance of poetry. He describes his essays as testimonies to the fact that poets themselves are finders and keepers, that their vocation is to look after art and life by being discoverers and custodians of the unlooked for. From this, we can deduce the idea that the duty of a poet or an artist is to look after art and life by becoming custodians of those that are unlooked for. It is true that in this era of technological development, man is losing a lot of things that he has preserved for centuries. Art and literature, especially poetry, will be useful in bringing back some of these values which are very much essential for a healthy life and a healthy culture. Heaney is also famous as a translator. He has translated the epic Anglo-Saxon poem Beowulf. It was published in 2000. This translation was considered to be a groundbreaking work because of the freedom he took in using modern language. Heaney's translation was appreciated by many. It was commented that The vitality of the traditional language is retained in the modern translation by Heaney. So, Heaney remains one such figure who has tried his hands on many different branches of literature, literary work like writing poetry, writing prose, doing translation, etc. Heaney was a poet who became extremely famous during his lifetime. In 2009, he turned 70, and to mark this occasion, Ireland radio broadcasted a long 12-hour recording of Heaney's poetry. It was announced that 2/3 of the poetry collections sold in UK in the previous year had been Heaney's titles. There was immense popularity for Heaney when poetry was considered to be not at all popular. The contemporary period is considered to be the age of novel, and poetry is read by very few people. It is in this context that we have to measure the greatness of Heaney as a poet. He is a poet who believed in the power of art and poetry. He believes that the technological development and the social transformation that results out of it will in no way spoil the significance of poetry as far as human life is concerned. I think we could conclude this discussion with the words of Heaney. He writes, "If poetry and the arts do anything, they can fortify your inner life, your inwardness." Thus, he reiterates the significance of poetry in fortifying our life. So far, we have been discussing some of the important aspects of Seamus Heaney's poetry. I hope you have got a general picture of the contributions of the poet Seamus Heaney, and for more details and for more explorations in this field, you can refer the section for further reading. I hope you will read his poetry as well as commentaries on his poetry. Thank you very much.